"We're putting you in a home, Dad. It's already decided." That's how my son told me. Not asked, told. Over Sunday dinner at my own table, with his wife sitting beside him, nodding along, like they were informing me of a decision about the weather. It's already decided. 41 years old, my boy, the one I taught to ride a bike and balance a checkbook, telling his father that his life had been arranged and packed, away without him in the room. They had it all worked out. The facility was picked. The paperwork, they said, was almost ready. All I had to do was sign a few things, let them handle my accounts and the house, so I wouldn't have to worry, and go quietly into a little room with a nurse's call button and somebody else's schedule. They were so sure. That's the part one keep coming back to. They were so completely certain that the confused old man would do as he was told, that they never once stopped to check the one thing that would have changed everything. They didn't know it existed, and by the time they found out, it was already 6 years too late. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Hank Sullivan. I'm 72 years old, and I live in a brick house I paid off 30 years ago on a quiet street in Brock Falls, Ohio. I've been a quiet man my whole life. Not slow, not soft in the head, whatever my son tried to tell a judge. Quiet, there's a difference. And my boy and his wife spent a year betting their whole future on confusing the two. It was the most expensive mistake either of them will ever make. Let me tell you who I am, so you understand what they were really calling worthless. I was a tool and die maker for 43 years. If you don't know the trade, it's the work behind the work, the men who build the precise steel molds and dies that stamp out the parts for everything else. It is a trade of thousandths of an inch. You cannot be sloppy. You cannot be forgetful. A toolmaker who loses track of details loses fingers, and I kept all 10 of mine for 43 years. I built parts that went into cars and airplanes and machines all over this country, and I did it by being the most careful, most precise, most exacting man on the floor. Forgetful. They told the courtroom I was forgetful. I spent my whole life making sure I never once forgot a single measurement, and my own son stood up and said my mind was going. I married Joan when I was 26. She was a Marchetti, a big, loud, warm Italian family from the East Side, and marrying Joan meant I got the whole clan, including her kid brother Sal, who was 19 and a pain in the neck and who became, over the next 45 years, the best friend I ever had. Joan and I had one son, Brian, late after years of trying. One boy. We poured everything into him. I'll give you one memory so you know what kind of father I tried to be and what it is that got betrayed. When Brian was 8, he was terrified of a school spelling bee, sick with it, couldn't sleep. So for 2 weeks straight, after my full shift on the floor, I'd come home with my hands still smelling of cutting oil, and I'd sit at the kitchen table and call out words to him, hundreds of them every night, until he could spell them in his sleep. He didn't win the spelling bee. He came in third, but he ran to me afterward like he'd won the world, and I carried him on my shoulders to the car, and I thought there was nothing on this earth I wouldn't do for that boy. I held on to that memory for a long time, longer than I should have. I held on to it right up until the afternoon my son sat in a lawyer's office and helped a stranger argue that the man who called out those words couldn't be trusted to spell his own name. I want to be fair about Brian, because the truth is more useful than the easy version. He wasn't born cruel. He was a sweet kid, a little soft, a little quick to want the easy way, but sweet. The trouble was Brian never liked the work. Not schoolwork, not yard work, not any work. He liked the having, not the earning. And a boy who likes having, but not earning, is a boy who spends his whole life looking for the shortcut. And the trouble with shortcuts is that eventually the shortest one runs straight through the people who love you. Joan died 4 years ago. A heart attack fast in the kitchen, with no warning and no goodbye. And I have never gotten over it. And I'm not going to pretend to you that I have. 44 years married. After she was gone, the house got so quiet I could hear the refrigerator hum. And I learned that grief is just love with nowhere left to go. And here is the thing that started all of it. After Joan died, Brian changed. Or maybe he didn't change. Maybe I just finally saw him clear. The way you see a part clear once you take it off the machine. Within a month of his mother's funeral, my son was at my kitchen table talking about money, about how the house was too big for one man, about how I wasn't getting any younger, about how it might be smart to start moving things around while there was still time. He was 40 years old. He'd never held a job longer than 3 years. His wife Megan had expensive taste and a small income, and my paid-off house and my retirement savings had started. I realized to look to them like a clock that was simply running too slow. I want to tell you about Megan because Brian was never the brains of it. Brian was the soft front. Megan was the one with the plan. She was always pleasant to my face, always Hank this and Hank that, but she was the one who'd send Brian over with the questions about my accounts, the one who started very casually, mentioning articles she'd read about senior living communities, the one who, I would learn, knew exactly how a family takes control of an old man who won't simply hand over the keys. Because I wouldn't. That was the problem they had to solve. I was healthy. I was sharp. I drove, I cooked, I did my own taxes. I fixed my own gutters at 71 years old. There was no honest way to take my house and my money out from under me, because there was nothing wrong with me. So they decided to make something wrong with me. On paper, it started so small I almost didn't see it. And this is the part I need you to understand, because it's the cruelest thing in this whole story, crueler than the home, crueler than the dinner. They set out, deliberately, patiently, to make me look like I was losing my mind. The first time I let it go. I had a doctor's appointment on a Tuesday, and Brian had offered to drive me, to help out. He showed up Wednesday. When I said the appointment was Tuesday, he frowned, gentle and sad, and said, "Dad, it was always Wednesday. Don't you remember? We talked about it twice. We had not." I knew we had not. But he said it so kindly, so sure, that for one cold second I doubted myself, and I saw something flicker behind his eyes when I did. Satisfaction. He'd found the trick, and the trick was working. After that, it was everything. My car keys would turn up in the freezer, and Brian would find them and sigh. A bill I knew I'd paid would show up unpaid, and Megan would quietly handle it and mention to whoever was listening that Hank's been forgetting things. They'd remind me of plans we never made, then look concerned when I didn't remember them. They started keeping a little list, I found out later, of incidents, every one of them manufactured, every one of them a lie dressed up as worry. There was one that I think about more than the others, because of how much planning it took and how cold a thing it was to do to a person. Megan organized a birthday dinner for one of the cousins and told me on the phone that it was Saturday at 6. I wrote it down. I always write things down, a toolmaker's habit. I showed up Saturday at 6 with a card and a bottle of wine. The restaurant had never heard of any party. I stood at the hostess stand, an old man holding a bottle of wine, while the girl shook her head, and I felt the first real spike of fear, because I had written it down and I had still gotten it wrong. Except I hadn't. The dinner had been Friday. Megan had told me Saturday on purpose, and told everyone else I'd gotten confused again and showed up a day late. Poor Hank. She built a whole story for the whole family out of one phone call and a lie, and they all believed it, because by then they'd been trained to. Then came the bank. Megan drove me there herself one afternoon, very helpful, very sweet, and tried to walk me up to a teller to add Brian as a joint owner on my checking account, just so he can help with the bills, Hank. Since they've been slipping, I said I'd think about it. She did not like that I said I'd think about it. A confused man, you see, isn't supposed to think. He's supposed to sign. I watched her face do a thing it didn't usually let me see, a flash of impatience, almost anger, and I filed it away with all the rest. I was filing everything away by then. They thought they were watching a hard drive fail. They were talking in front of a tape recorder, and they did it in front of people. That was the strategy. At family gatherings, Brian would ask me a question, and before I could answer, he'd jump in. "It's okay, Dad. Take your time," like I'd been struggling when I hadn't even started. He'd tell stories about my confusion to cousins, to neighbors, sad little stories, shaking his head, building a picture for an audience that would matter later. By the time a year had passed, half the people in my life had been carefully taught to see a fading old man where a sharp one was standing. I want to tell you what that does to a person, to have the people you love tell you, over and over, kindly, that your own mind is betraying you. There were nights I lay awake genuinely afraid, genuinely wondering. That's how good it was. That's how cruel. They weren't just trying to take my house. They were trying to make me hand it over by convincing me I was too broken to keep it. The lowest night, I got out of bed at 2 in the morning, and I went down to my workshop in the basement, and I picked up a set of measurements for a job I'd done 30 years ago, a complicated one, and I worked the whole thing through in my head, every cut, every tolerance, just to prove to myself I still could. And I could. I did it perfectly. And then I sat down on my workbench stool, and I put my face in my hands, because a man should not have to spend his nights proving to himself that he isn't crazy. That's what they took from me before they ever got near my money. They took the simple piece of trusting my own mind. I will forgive a great many things in this life. I have not entirely forgiven that. What saved me in those weeks was Sal, though he didn't know yet what was happening. Every other Saturday we'd fish, and Sal would talk to me about the ball game and the old neighborhood and argue with me about things the way he had for 45 years, treating me exactly like the man I'd always been. And I realized, sitting in that boat, that there was one place in my life where I was still completely myself, still sharp, still Hank, and it was the one place Brian and Megan couldn't reach. That's when I started to understand that the version of me they were building didn't actually exist anywhere except in the story they were telling. And a story, no matter how many people believe it, can be taken apart by one man who refuses to play his role in it. The Sunday dinner, the It's Already Decided dinner, was meant to be the finish. They'd softened the ground for a year. Now they came with the brochure, a glossy thing for a place called Whispering Pines, and they slid it across my own table. And Brian said the words and Megan nodded, and they waited for the confused old man to be relieved that someone was finally taking the burden of his life off his hands. I looked at that brochure, Whispering Pines, a photograph of strangers playing cards, and I looked at my son's face, the boy I taught to ride a bike, and I felt something happen in me that I hadn't felt since Joan died. Not rage, something colder and far more useful. A toolmaker's calm. The calm of a man looking at a flawed part and knowing, exactly, to the thousandth of an inch, what has to be done. Because here is what they didn't know. Here is the thing they never thought to check. The thing that turned their whole careful year into a house built on sand. But first I had to be sure. So I did what a quiet man does. I picked up the brochure, and I looked at it for a long moment, and I let my hand tremble just slightly, and I said, "Maybe you're right, son. Maybe it's time. Let me think it over." And I watched the relief flood their faces, and underneath it, that flicker of triumph again. And I knew, watching them, that I had been right about all of it. They weren't worried about me. They had never once been worried about me. They were closing a deal. I let them think the deal was closing. And then I drove to see Sal. Sal Marchetti, Joan's kid brother, was 70 now himself, a retired bank branch manager, and he'd been my fishing partner every other Saturday for 45 years. Sal was the one person left on earth who still talked to me like a man, with a working brain, because Sal saw me every 2 weeks and knew perfectly well there was nothing wrong with my mind. When I sat down across from him and told him everything, the keys in the freezer, the incidents, the brochure, It's Already Decided, Sal didn't say a word for a long time. Then he got up, and he poured us each a glass of the bad whiskey he saves for serious occasions, and he set one in front of me, and he said, "Hank, you remember what we did 6 years ago?" And I did. Of course I did. My mind, you'll recall, works just fine. 6 years ago, 2 years before Joan passed, Sal had sat me down after one too many stories about Brian borrowing money he never paid back, and Sal, who'd spent his whole life watching families fall apart over money at his bank, had said, "Hank, I love that boy because he's Joan's, but you need to protect yourself, because love and money don't mix, and you never know what a soft man with a hard wife will do when you're old." And he'd sent me to a sharp estate attorney named Ellen Ross, and together the three of us, we'd done something, quietly, carefully, the way a toolmaker does everything. We'd put the house and the bulk of my savings into an irrevocable living trust. I want to explain what that means in plain words, because it's the whole hinge of the story, and Brian and Megan, for all their planning, never understood it, because they never knew it was there to understand. An irrevocable trust isn't a thing you own anymore. It's a thing that owns itself, with rules you set in advance, managed by a trustee you name. I had put my house and my money into that trust 6 years ago, with a rule that said I get to live in my house, cared for the rest of my natural life. And I had named one trustee, one person on this earth I trusted to manage it according to those rules. I named Sal. Do you understand what that meant? It meant that the house was not mine to be tricked out of, because I didn't legally own it anymore. The trust did. It meant that even if Brian got himself made my legal guardian, even if he got a judge to declare me a drooling vegetable, he would have control of my person and not one single dollar of my property, because a guardian controls the ward's assets, and I had no assets. I had a right to live in a house owned by a trust controlled by Sal. Brian could no more sell my house or empty my accounts than he could sell the moon. They had spent a year, a cruel and patient year, building a key to a lock that didn't exist. The treasure they were maneuvering to seize had been moved out of the room 6 years before they ever started planning the heist. Sal looked at me across his kitchen table, the whiskey between us, and for the first time in a year somebody looked at me like I was the sharpest man in the room, which I was. "Hank," he said, "they're not trying to put you in a home. They're trying to rob a house that's already empty. The question is what you want to do about it. And I'll tell you, the easy thing, the thing my anger wanted, was to just spring it on Brian. Tell him the truth. Watch his face. But I'm a tool maker. You don't stop a flawed part halfway. You let the machine show you the whole flaw before you fix it. Because they hadn't just tried to take my money. They tried to take my mind, my name, my dignity, in front of everyone I knew. And a lie that public needs a correction, just as public, or it never really dies. So I made my plan. And the first thing I did was the hardest. I let them keep going. For the next few weeks I played a little forgetful. Not much, just enough. I misplaced things. I let Brian remind me of conversations and pretended to be grateful for the help. And careful man that I am, I documented every single thing they did. The dates Brian claimed appointments had changed. The bills mysteriously left unpaid. I started keeping my own list, the mirror image of theirs, except mine was true. And on Sal's advice, I quietly did 2 more things. First, I went to see my own doctor, a good man who'd known me 20 years, and I asked him for a full cognitive evaluation, the real kind, the formal kind, with a specialist. I sat through every test. I named the date, the season, the president. I counted backward from 100 by 7s. I remembered the 3 words they give you at the start and ask for again at the end. I drew the clock. There is something humbling, I'll tell you, about a 72-year-old man working that hard to prove he is what he has always plainly been. And there were a couple of moments in that quiet office where my eyes stung. Not from any failure, but from the sheer indignity of having to sit for the test at all. The specialist, a kind young woman, finished, set down her clipboard and said, "Mr. Sullivan, I'll be honest with you. Your scores are better than people half your age. Whatever's going on in your family, it isn't your mind." The report came back exactly as I knew it would. No impairment. Cognition fully intact for my age, sharp as a tack. I had it in writing, signed by a geriatric specialist, dated. A document that said, in medical and legal terms, that the confused old man was nothing of the kind. Second, and I'm not ashamed of this, the next time Brian and Megan came to discuss the arrangements, I left my phone recording on the kitchen counter, and I asked a few gentle, leading questions, the kind a confused old man might ask. And they answered. Megan especially. Megan, who thought she was talking to a man whose memory wouldn't hold the conversation past Tuesday, explained to me, slowly and a little impatiently, exactly how it would all work. How once they had control, they'd sell the house, because honestly, Hank, it's just sitting there. How the money would be managed by them. How Whispering Pines was the cheap one, so there'd be more left over, she said, and I have it on the recording. She said, "It's not like you're going to need it, Hank. It's not like you're going to need it." I thanked her. I made them tea, and I let them leave thinking the deal was closing. It was closing, just not theirs. Brian filed for guardianship about a month later. That was the move they'd been building to all along, a legal petition to have me declared incompetent and to make Brian my guardian with control over my person and my property. He'd been gathering his evidence for a year, the incidents, the witnesses, the sad shaking head. He thought he had an airtight case for a foggy old man who couldn't be trusted with his own life. He filed it certain he'd won. And he almost got ahead of me, because Megan, who really was the dangerous one, didn't just file the regular petition. She had Brian's lawyer also request an emergency temporary guardianship, the kind a court can grant fast before any real hearing if a person is claimed to be in immediate danger. The petition said I was a risk to myself, that I'd been wondering. That money needed to be secured right away for my protection. For about 10 days, there was a real chance a judge would sign an emergency order that froze my accounts and put Brian in charge of me before I ever got to say a word. I'll be honest, those 10 days frightened me more than anything else in this story. It's one thing to know you're right. It's another to watch a system move fast on a stack of lies and feel how easily a quiet, truthful man can be steamrolled by a loud false, one who got to the paperwork first. If that emergency order had been signed, the trust would still have protected my money. Sal would still have held the line, but Brian would have had legal control of my person, my medical decisions, where I lived, for however long it took to undo. I lay awake those nights the way I had during the worst of the gaslighting, except now I wasn't doubting my mind. I was just afraid for it. Sal and Ellen Ross moved fast. Ellen got my cognitive evaluation in front of the emergency judge within 48 hours. The formal one, the real one, and a sworn statement from my own doctor of 20 years. And she made the simple point that a man with a board-certified, clean bill of cognitive health is not an emergency. The judge denied the emergency order and set the matter for a full hearing. We'd won the first round, but it taught me something I won't forget. The bully who moves first and loudest very nearly wins every time against the quiet man who assumes the truth will speak for itself. The truth doesn't speak for itself. You have to put it on the judge's desk before the lie gets there. So that's what we set out to do. There was one moment before the hearing that I want to tell you about, because it nearly broke me, and you should know I'm not made of steel, even if I work in it. A week before the court date, Brian came by alone. And for just a moment he wasn't the schemer. He sat in his mother's kitchen, and he looked tired and young, and he said, "Dad, I know you think I'm the bad guy here, but you can't take care of yourself forever. I'm doing this for you, and God help me." For one moment I wanted to believe him because he's my boy, and a father always wants to believe his boy. But then he said, "And honestly, the house is wasted on one person. Be reasonable." And there it was again. The house. Always underneath everything. The house. He couldn't help himself. He'd come to perform love, and he couldn't get through 5 minutes without the price tag showing. That was the night I stopped grieving the son I thought I had, and started getting ready to meet the one I actually did. The hearing was in a small county courtroom on a gray Tuesday. Brian came with Megan and a lawyer and a folder full of a year's worth of manufactured worry. He'd told his version to enough people that he had a couple of witnesses too, cousins who'd heard his sad stories and believed them. He sat down on his side of that courtroom looking like a concerned, exhausted son doing a hard and loving thing. And I sat on my side with Sal, and with Ellen Ross, the attorney, and I was, I'll admit, a little frightened, because a courtroom is a place where the loudest story can beat the truest one. But I had Ellen Ross, and Ellen Ross is not loud. She's precise. My kind of person. Brian's lawyer went first and laid out the picture. The forgetful old man, the keys, the bills, the worried family, the year of decline. It sounded, I have to admit, convincing. Several times I saw the judge, an older woman with reading glasses and a flat, unreadable face, make a note. Then it was Ellen's turn, and she didn't argue. She just, like Sal in the kitchen, like me on the shop floor, started laying things down, one at a time. First, the cognitive evaluation. The full formal report from the geriatric specialist, dated the month before Brian filed, stating clearly that I had no cognitive impairment whatsoever. She handed it to the judge. "Your Honor," she said, "the petitioner claims a year of mental decline. Here is a board-certified specialist's formal finding from this same period that Mr. Sullivan's cognition is entirely intact. The petitioner never sought a single medical evaluation in his year of concern. Not one. He gathered anecdotes. We gathered a diagnosis. I watched the judge read it. I watched her glasses come down a little on her nose. Then Ellen laid down my list, the true one. Every incident Brian had cited matched against the facts. The appointment that was always Tuesday, the bills paid on time, dated, documented. The petitioner's evidence of decline, Ellen said, is item by item manufactured. We can account for each one. Then she turned to Brian's witnesses. He'd brought 2 cousins who'd signed statements about my confusion. Ellen was very gentle with them, almost kind, which was somehow worse. She asked the first one, my cousin Raymond's boy, a simple question. "When you say you witnessed Mr. Sullivan's confusion, can you describe one specific thing you personally saw him do? Not something you were told. Something you watched happen with your own eyes." And the young man opened his mouth and closed it and finally admitted that, well, no, he hadn't actually seen anything himself. Brian had told him about it. Brian had told him a lot of things. Ellen thanked him and sat him down. She did the same with the second one and got the same answer. Brian's entire crowd of witnesses, it turned out, had witnessed nothing at all. They'd witnessed Brian talking. The whole picture of my decline existed only in the stories my son had spent a year telling, and the moment anyone asked, "But what did you actually see?" it dissolved like sugar in rain. And then, because Ellen Ross is thorough, she asked to play a short recording. And in that quiet courtroom, my daughter-in-law's voice came out of a little speaker, slow and impatient, explaining to a man she thought couldn't remember it, how they'd sell the house he was wasting, how there'd be more left over at the cheap facility, how it's not like you're going to need it, Hank. The courtroom was very, very quiet. Brian had gone the color of ash. Megan was staring at the table. Brian's lawyer tried to recover. He stood and objected to the recording, asked for a recess, suggested his client was emotional, and the words were taken out of context. Judge let him finish, and then she said dryly that she'd heard the context, that the context was a recording of his clients planning to sell a man's home out from under him, and that she'd allow it. Then she did something I didn't expect. She looked at me directly, and she asked if I wished to say anything to the court. I did. I stood up, slowly, because I'm 72 and my knees are 72, but my voice was steady, and I looked at that judge and I said, "Your Honor, my son says I can't be trusted to run my own life. I was a tool and die maker for 43 years. I worked to tolerances of 1,000th of an inch every day for longer than my son has been alive, and I never once made a mistake that cost a man a finger, because in my trade you cannot afford to forget anything. I still do my own taxes. I drove myself to this courthouse this morning. The only thing I have forgotten in this whole affair is what it felt like to trust the boy I raised. And I'd give a great deal to forget the past year entirely. But my memory, as the court can see, works just fine. And I sat back down. The judge looked at me for a moment, and something in her flat face moved just slightly, the way a face moves when a person has just watched the truth walk into a room. Then she turned to my son, and then the judge took off her reading glasses, and she looked at my son for a long moment, and she asked him one question. Just one. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, "your petition seeks control of your father's property as well as his person. So I'd like you to tell me, what, specifically, do you believe your father's assets to be?" And Brian, flustered, off script, stammered out the house, the savings, the retirement accounts, the numbers he and Megan had been counting for years. And Ellen Ross stood up, and she set one last document on the bench. "Your Honor," she said, "Mr. Sullivan's father holds no such assets. The home and the accounts the petitioner just described have been held for 6 years in an irrevocable trust established long before this petition, managed by an independent trustee. They are not Mr. Sullivan's to lose, and they would not, under any guardianship, become the petitioners to control." Which raises the question of what exactly this petition was ever truly for. I watched my son understand. I watched it land on him, all of it at once, the Evel, the list, the recording, and finally the trust, the great locked empty vault he'd spent a year breaking into. He looked at me across that courtroom, and for the first time in a year he saw me. Not the old man he'd invented, me, the toolmaker, the man who measures twice, the man who 6 years ago, quietly and without a word, had made certain that no soft son and no hard wife could ever take what Joan and I built. The judge dismissed the petition in about 4 minutes. She had some words for Brian and his lawyer about the seriousness of what she'd seen, words I won't repeat because they were hard ones, and a note in the record that I'm told is not a good thing to have. And then it was over. I did not destroy my son that day, though I could have. I didn't press for the things Ellen said I could press for, the perjury referral, the costs, the harder roads. He's still Joan's boy. But I'll tell you what I did do, walking out of that courtroom into the gray afternoon with Sal's hand on my shoulder. I went home, to my home, the one nobody could take, and I changed exactly one more document, the one Ellen had ready and waiting. The trust, after I'm gone, no longer goes to Brian, it goes to a scholarship at the trade school where I learned my craft, for kids who like to work with their hands, kids from families with no money and too much grit, the kind of kids I was. Brian will get a letter someday after I'm gone, explaining that the house he was so sure was wasted on one old man went instead to 100 young people who understood, the way he never did, that you don't inherit a thing. You earn it. I think about that letter sometimes. I won't be there to see him read it, but I know exactly what it will say, because I wrote it myself in my own careful hand, and it ends with the only thing I have left to teach him. Be a man your children won't have to protect themselves from. Brian and I speak now a little carefully. The damage is the damage, and I'm too old and too honest to pretend a few phone calls undo a year of being told my own mind was rotting. Megan, I don't see, and I don't ask after her. But every other Saturday I'm out on the lake with Sal, the man who told me 45 years ago he was a pain in the neck and then spent his whole life proving he was the opposite. The man who, when everyone else was building a case that I was losing my mind, simply poured me a whiskey and asked if I remembered what we'd done 6 years before. We don't talk much out there. We never did. We just fish and let the water do the talking. And sometimes in the quiet, I think about Joan, gone 4 years now, and I think she'd be glad. Not that it happened. No mother wants to learn this about her son, but glad that I'd seen it coming in my careful way and had quietly, years in advance, made sure that the people we loved could never turn what we built into a weapon against me. They spent a year trying to prove I'd lost my mind. They never once noticed that 6 years before I'd quietly made sure they could never have it. A careful man isn't a man with nothing to lose. He's a man who decided long ago exactly who gets to take it. And it was never, ever going to be them.